When I was cleaning the bedroom, I found a long blonde hair on our bed. My hair is dark. I said nothing. I just put it in a gift bag and handed it to my husband. What happened next changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think our house was the kind of place people dreamed about, not in an over-the-top way, nothing like those sprawling estates you see in magazines. It was a 4-bedroom colonial in Elmhurst, Illinois, with a wraparound porch. Daniel and I had repainted ourselves the summer after we moved in, 11 years ago. We'd laughed the whole afternoon, gotten cream-colored paint in our hair, ordered pizza because neither of us had the energy to cook. That was us. That was what I thought we were. We met in our late 20s at a work conference in Atlanta. He was presenting on risk assessment. I was attending for my marketing firm. He had this calm, deliberate way of speaking, like every word had been considered before it left his mouth. I found it attractive then. I would find it sinister later. We married at 30, bought the Elmhurst house at 32, and by 35 I had quietly shelved the conversation about children because Daniel kept saying not yet, and I kept believing him. I had my career, senior marketing manager at a mid-sized consumer goods company downtown. I had my friends, my Saturday morning runs along the Salt Creek Trail, my book club that met every third Thursday. My life was full, or I told myself it was. The first thing I noticed was the phone. Daniel had always been someone who left his phone on the kitchen counter when he got home. It was a habit, almost a ritual. Keys on the hook, jacket on the chair, phone face up on the counter. Then, sometime around February, the phone started going everywhere with him. To the bathroom, to the garage when he went to get a beer, to bed, placed face down on his nightstand instead of charging on the dresser where it always had been. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I filed it away in a part of my mind I wasn't ready to open yet. Then there were the late nights. Daniel worked in finance. Long hours weren't unusual, especially during earnings season. But March and April brought a new frequency to it. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4. He'd text around 6, big project, don't wait up. He'd come home smelling like he'd showered at the office, which, he explained, he sometimes did when he went to the gym after work. He'd joined a gym, apparently. He looked good, leaner. I should have taken that as a compliment to our marriage. I didn't. The distance was harder to name than the phone or the hours. It was the way he'd stopped reaching for my hand during movies, the way conversations at dinner had narrowed to logistics. Whose turn to call the plumber? Had I scheduled the car service? Did I remember to pay the HOA fee? We used to talk about everything: books, politics, the neighbors, old memories, hypothetical futures. Now we managed a household together like 2 people sharing an office lease. I told myself it was a phase. Couples go through phases. 11 years is a long time, and sometimes you drift and then you drift back. I told myself this on my morning runs. I told myself this while I fell asleep on my side of the bed, careful not to cross some invisible line that had appeared between us without announcement. Then came the Saturday in early May, when I decided to clean the bedroom. I mean, really clean it. The kind of cleaning you put off for months, moving furniture, vacuuming under the bed, changing the mattress pad, washing the curtains. Daniel had gone to his mother's in Naperville for the afternoon. I had the house to myself and 4 hours and a restless, nameless energy that needed somewhere to go. I stripped the bed. I flipped the mattress. I was reaching to pull the duvet cover free when something caught the light near the far edge of the bed, near Daniel's pillow. A single hair, long, straight, pale blonde. I stood there for a moment without breathing, My hair is dark brown, almost black, cut to just below my chin, has been my whole life. I touched the hair, barely with 2 fingers, and held it up to the light from the window. It was easily 10 inches long. Fine. Light as air. There was a rational explanation. There was always a rational explanation. And I stood in that bedroom, cycling through them, the way you do when your mind is desperately trying to protect you from something it already knows. A friend who'd sat on our bed, a cousin who'd visited, a hair that had traveled from somewhere improbable on a piece of clothing. But Daniel's mother had gray hair. My friends hadn't been in our bedroom, and no one had mentioned sleeping here. I set the hair down on the nightstand. I finished making the bed. I finished cleaning the room. Then I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table thinking for a very long time. When Daniel got home at 6, I was calm. We had dinner. We watched television. He went to bed early, said he was tired. I went to the hall closet and found a small gold gift bag left over from Christmas, the kind with the tissue paper peeking out the top. Carefully, I placed the hair inside, folded the tissue paper over it, tied the ribbon, and the next morning at breakfast, I slid it across the table to him. "What's this?" He looked genuinely confused, maybe even pleased for a half second, the way a man looks when he thinks he's receiving a small, spontaneous gift. "Open it," I said. He looked inside. The color left his face so completely and so fast that I had my answer before he said a single word. He said it wasn't what I thought. They always say that. I know that now, though I didn't have the vocabulary for they yet. Didn't want to. Hadn't earned it through the terrible education that was coming. He said it wasn't what I thought. And when I just looked at him, he said he could explain. And when I kept looking at him, something in his face shifted, and he put the bag down on the table between us and said very quietly, "I don't know whose hair that is." Which was, of course, the worst possible thing he could have said, because it wasn't a denial. It was a deflection dressed as ignorance, and I had known Daniel Ellison for over a decade, and I knew the difference. I didn't scream. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect screaming, expect dishes thrown and doors slammed and the dramatic architecture of a betrayal scene. I didn't give him any of that. I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, and said I was going for a run. He called after me. I closed the front door behind me and walked to the end of the driveway before I let myself breathe. The Salt Creek Trail was quiet that morning. It was a Sunday, overcast, the kind of May sky that can't decide if it wants to rain. I ran 4 miles without stopping, which was 2 more than my usual, and by the time I turned back, I had moved through something, not past it, not over it, but through it, the way you push through cold water until your body adjusts. Here is what I knew: running. My marriage was over. I didn't know the details yet. I didn't know her name or how long or how many times or what he'd told her about me. But I knew the thing I'd been not knowing for months had a shape now, and the shape was a pale blonde hair in a gold gift bag, and Daniel's face when he saw it. Here is what I feared: running. Everything practical. The house, our joint accounts. My name on his health insurance because my company's plan had been discontinued 2 years ago, and we'd never gotten around to switching me back. The way 11 years of financial lives get tangled together like headphone cords in a drawer, impossible to separate without breaking something. I feared being the person who fell apart. I feared being the person everyone looked at with that particular kind of pity, the kind that is warm on the surface and quietly condescending underneath. Poor Mara. She had no idea, but underneath the fear, something else was forming. I came home from the run, and Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table where I'd left him, which surprised me. I'd half expected him to be gone, to have taken the cowardly exit that some men take, the disappearing act. He was still there. He'd made fresh coffee. He looked like he hadn't moved. I showered and changed and came back downstairs and told him I needed time to think and that I needed him to sleep in the guest room that night. He nodded. He didn't argue. That told me something too. A man with nothing to hide argues. A man with everything to lose complies. I called my older sister Patricia that afternoon, not to tell her everything, not yet, but because I needed to hear a voice that was entirely mine, that had known me before Daniel, that had no stake in our marriage surviving. Patricia lived in Portland and she was direct and unsentimental, and I loved her for exactly that. I told her I was having a hard week and might need to come visit soon. She said the guest room was always ready. Good, I thought. Good to know. That night, after Daniel had gone upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and I did what I do when I'm overwhelmed by something. I organized it. I wrote down what I knew. I wrote down what I suspected. I wrote down what I needed to find out. And then I wrote down in a column on the right side of the page what I needed to protect. My name was on the mortgage. Good. The house had appreciated significantly. Elmhurst had become desirable, and we'd bought at the right time. Our joint savings account held enough to matter. I had my own 401k through work that Daniel had no access to. I had my salary, which was solid. What I didn't have was documentation, evidence, the kind of paper trail that transforms a suspicion into a legal fact. That was what I needed first. I knew one person who might help me find it, a woman named Gloria Chen, who worked in HR at my company and who had gone through a divorce 3 years ago that she described, with the particular black humor of a survivor, as the most expensive education of my life. Gloria had mentioned once, over drinks at a work event, the name of the private investigator she'd hired. She'd said it matter-of-factly, without drama. If you ever need him, his name is Ray Kowalski. He's thorough and he's discreet. I hadn't written the name down then, but I remembered it. I looked Ray Kowalski up on my phone. He had a modest website, minimal and professional. No flashy graphics, no promises. Just a phone number, an email, a list of services that included surveillance and documentation of suspected infidelity, and a short paragraph that said, "I don't make judgments. I find facts." I sent him an email that night from a Gmail account I created for the purpose. Not my regular email, not anything connected to Daniel or our shared life. I explained my situation in 3 short paragraphs. I asked about availability and rates. Then I closed the laptop, washed my face, and went to bed. I didn't sleep much, but I had a plan now, or the beginning of one, and that was the first thing in days that felt like solid ground under my feet. Ray Kowalski called me the following Tuesday at noon, when I'd stepped out of the office to take it. He had a flat, unhurried voice, the kind that probably worked well in his line of work. Nothing about him that would make you nervous or dramatic. He asked a few questions. How long married? Did my husband travel for work? Did I have any names or locations I suspected? I told him what I had. He quoted me a rate, a retainer up front, hourly after that, with a written report and photographic documentation included. It was expensive. It was also, I thought, the most important money I would ever spend. I had opened a personal checking account 2 weeks before, solo, at a bank different from the one where Daniel and I had our joint accounts. I'd moved a modest amount from my own paycheck, below the threshold that might show up noticeably on a shared statement. This was not hiding money. This was protecting it. There is a difference, and I understood that distinction would matter later. I hired Ray that same day. While Ray worked, I worked. I called an attorney, a family law specialist named Sandra Okafor, recommended by a quick, discreet Google search that I did on my work computer during lunch, logged into a private browsing window. Sandra's office was in Oak Park. I booked a consultation for the following Thursday and told Daniel I had a work dinner that night. He didn't question it. He'd been walking around the house for 2 weeks like a man bracing for a storm he knew was coming. Quiet and careful and watchful in a way that almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. I say the two of them began to understand something was shifting because of what happened on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into Ray's surveillance. Daniel came home from work agitated in a way that was different from his usual tired quiet. He poured himself a scotch, unusual on a weeknight, and asked me with a studied casualness that didn't quite land how I was feeling about everything. I told him I was taking it one day at a time. He asked if I'd talked to anyone. A therapist, he meant, or a friend. I said I'd been talking to Patricia. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. That's good. Then, you haven't talked to anyone else? Like professionally? I looked at him. What do you mean? I just mean, I want us to work through this together, Mara. I don't want lawyers involved. I don't want this to get... He trailed off. Complicated? I offered. Ugly, he said. I told him I understood. I went upstairs to read. My hands were steady. My heart was not. He knew or suspected that I was not sitting still, which meant she knew or suspected it too, because by then I had a name. Ray had given it to me 10 days in. Courtney Walsh, 29 years old, an analyst at Daniel's firm. He'd sent me the first photographs with a brief message, confirmation of regular meetings outside office context. More to follow. The photographs were taken in the parking lot of a restaurant in Wicker Park. Daniel's car, Courtney's profile, his hand at the small of her back as they walked toward the entrance. Time-stamped, date-stamped, clear. I had printed them at the FedEx on my lunch hour using cash and locked them in my filing cabinet at work inside a manila folder labeled Q2 Vendor Contacts. But that Wednesday night, when Daniel asked me about lawyers, I understood that something had changed. Either he had noticed something, my separate bank account perhaps, or an inquiry on a shared credit card. I had been so careful. I had used cash for everything related to this. Or Courtney had noticed something, or he had simply become frightened by my stillness. The truly frightened person in a marriage is never the one who cries. I was learning. It is the one who goes quiet. The point of no return came on a Friday afternoon 3 days later. Ray sent me a second report, not photographs this time, but a document. He had, through means he described only as publicly available records cross-referenced with professional contacts, confirmed that Daniel and Courtney Walsh had taken a trip together in February. A long weekend, Door County, Wisconsin. He had a hotel receipt, obtained from a source he declined to name, showing a double room booked under Daniel's corporate card. February. When Daniel had told me he was attending a conference in Minneapolis, when I had been in Elmhurst alone, running on the trail, convincing myself the phone habits and the late nights were a phase. I sat in my car in the office parking garage and read the document twice. Then I forwarded it to Sandra Okafor's secure client portal, along with the photographs. Then I called Patricia. I have what I need, I said. There was a pause. What are you going to do? Everything, I said, but carefully. Sandra Okafor had a corner office in Oak Park with tall windows that looked out onto a row of elms, and she had a way of sitting very still while she listened that reminded me, oddly, of Ray Kowalski. People who deal with disasters for a living learn to be calm. I found it steadying. I had brought everything to her second meeting: the photographs in the manila folder, the hotel document, my notes from the legal pad, a printout of our shared financial accounts going back 18 months, and a flash drive with the original digital files backed up twice. Once on the drive, once in a cloud storage account Daniel had no access to. Sandra spread the materials across her desk without expression and read for several minutes while I sat across from her and watched the elms move in the wind outside. When she looked up, she said, "This is enough to file. More than enough." She explained what the process would look like. Illinois is not a fault state, meaning infidelity would not directly determine the financial outcome. But the February trip, paid for on a corporate card, might constitute marital waste if it could be established that he'd knowingly used shared resources to fund the affair. Combined with the length of the marriage, my contributions to the household, and our shared assets, Sandra's assessment was clear. "You're in a strong position, Mara." I authorized her to file. She sent the papers to Daniel's office the following Tuesday. I know the exact moment he received them because I was home that afternoon, working remotely, when his car pulled into the driveway at 2 p.m., 4 hours before he was ever home. I watched from the upstairs window. He sat in the car for 8 minutes. I counted. When he came inside, he didn't come upstairs. He stood in the kitchen and I heard him make 2 calls, both short, both in a voice too low to make out. Then it was quiet. That night, he came to the doorway of the bedroom. He'd been in the guest room for 3 weeks by then, and said we needed to talk. He was not the careful, controlled Daniel of the past weeks. He was pale, and his jaw was tight, and there was something almost electric in his stillness, the coiled quality of someone trying very hard not to say what they actually want to say. He asked me to withdraw the filing. He said we could still fix this. He said he'd made a terrible mistake, and he took full responsibility. He said Courtney meant nothing. That was the first time her name passed between us out loud, and the fact that he said it, volunteered it, dropped it into the room like something he'd calculated would defuse me, told me exactly how afraid he was. I told him my attorney would be in contact with his attorney. He left the doorway. I heard him downstairs for another hour before the house went quiet. The call from Courtney Walsh came 3 days later. I didn't know her number, but I'd seen her face in Ray's photographs enough times to feel I'd know her voice. And when she said my name, her first word to me, I was certain. She was younger sounding than I'd expected, and nervous, and she opened with, "I think we should meet. I can explain things." I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "Courtney, I'm going to ask you not to contact me again. Anything you have to say can go through my attorney." A pause. Then something shifted in her voice. The nervousness hardened into something colder. "You think you're very smart," she said. "But Daniel and I have been together for 2 years. 2 years. I'm not going anywhere. And if you push this, I promise you, I will make this as difficult as possible for you." 2 years. I absorbed that. Our 11th anniversary had been last September. He had brought me flowers from the grocery store. I had made his favorite dinner. We had watched a film and gone to bed early. "Good night, Courtney," I said, and hung up. I called Sandra immediately and told her about the call. She noted it and told me not to engage further. Then she told me something that straightened my spine. Courtney had called from her personal cell phone, which could be documented. The threat, "I will make this as difficult as possible," was also documented now. "She's done you a favor," Sandra said dryly. That night, I packed a bag and drove to Patricia's in Portland. I needed 3 days outside the house, outside Elmhurst, outside the orbit of that kitchen table and guest room and driveway where Daniel had sat for 8 minutes in his car. I needed to sleep in a room where none of this had happened yet. Patricia didn't ask me too many questions. She made dinner and poured wine, and we stayed up late the first night just talking about old things, childhood things, the summer we'd spent in Cape Cod when we were young. On the second day, I slept until 10 o'clock and took a long walk near her neighborhood and called Sandra once to check in and otherwise let myself exist at a remove from the machinery I'd set in motion. I would need the rest. I already knew that. What was coming would require me to be very steady. When I came back from Portland, the house felt different to me. Not worse, just smaller. Like I had grown slightly while I was away and returned to find the ceilings lower than I remembered. Daniel was home when I arrived. He'd clearly cleaned the kitchen, which he almost never did, and there was food in the refrigerator that he must have shopped for. Small, careful gestures, the architecture of a man trying. He asked if we could have dinner together. I said yes, because I was not at war with him, exactly. I was simply unwilling to be diminished by him any further. There's a difference, and I was getting better at locating it. Over dinner, he tried a different approach. The pleading and the pressure of the previous weeks had shifted into something softer, almost wistful. He talked about the early days, the conference in Atlanta where we'd met, the wraparound porch we'd painted, the trips we'd taken in our 30s. He wasn't wrong about any of it. The memories were real. That was what made it difficult, the realness of them. I threw away something real, he said. I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm just asking you to not close the door completely. I looked at him across the table that had been ours for 9 years, in the kitchen of the house I had helped buy and maintain and fill with 11 years of a shared life, and I felt, surprisingly, very little anger. What I felt was clarity, which is, I think, what you get on the other side of anger when you've had enough time alone to let it finish burning. The door is closed, Daniel, I said, not cruelly, simply. He nodded once. He didn't push further that night. That surprised me, and I filed it away. Courtney, meanwhile, had gone quiet after Sandra's formal notification that any further direct contact with me would be documented and could constitute harassment. The sudden silence from someone who had called me to deliver a threat felt, paradoxically, louder than the call itself. I could feel them, both of them, watching, recalibrating, waiting to see if I would waver. I did not waver, but I also knew I couldn't do this entirely alone. I reached out to 3 people in those weeks, deliberately, not to unburden myself, but to rebuild the social scaffolding I'd let go, thin over the years of a marriage that had gradually narrowed my world. There was Patricia, already in my corner. There was Gloria Chen from work, who met me for coffee and didn't say I told you so even once, which I appreciated enormously. Gloria had been through it. She knew the topography of this particular grief, the way it isn't only about the betrayal, but about the decade of small surrenders that preceded it, the ways you make yourself smaller to preserve something that was already disappearing. You're going to be okay, Gloria told me, and the way she said it, not as comfort, but as information, the way you'd report a weather forecast, made me believe her. The third person was my therapist. I had seen Dr. Ann Keene sporadically over the years, a few sessions after a stressful period at work, a handful more when Daniel and I had hit a rough patch 4 years ago that we'd navigated with the particular stubbornness of 2 people who'd rather fix something than admit it might be broken. I called Ann's office and booked a standing appointment, Wednesdays at noon. The first session, she mostly let me talk. The second, she asked me one question that stayed with me. What do you want your life to look like in 5 years? Not what's fair, not what you're owed. What do you want? I had to think about it for a long time. That, too, felt like information. I kept working. I ran the Salt Creek Trail on Saturday mornings. I had dinner with Gloria twice. I stayed for Patricia's voice every few days on the phone. I tended to the case with Sandra carefully and without drama, providing documents when she asked, reviewing drafts of filings, asking questions I'd written down between sessions so I wouldn't forget. The process was slower than I'd imagined. People think divorce is an event. It is actually a season, sometimes a year, and the weather within it is highly variable. There were days that were almost normal. A good meeting at work, a good run, an evening with a book that absorbed me completely, and then days that were like walking in wet concrete. I gave myself permission for both kinds, and I waited. Because I had looked at Daniel carefully over dinner, the night he spoke about Atlanta and the porch, and I had seen something I recognized, a man who had not yet used his most powerful argument. Whatever he was holding back, he would use it. Courtney, too, was holding something. The silence was not surrender. It was preparation. They came on a Sunday afternoon in August, 3 months into the legal process. When I say they, I mean Daniel and his attorney, a man named Philip Garrett, who had the smooth, unhurried manner of someone who charged $400 an hour and wanted you to know it was worth it. They came to the house, which was, strictly speaking, still Daniel's legal residence, even though he had moved his things to a rented apartment in Downers Grove in July. His attorney had called Sandra the day before to request a informal sit-down, no pressure, just conversation. Sandra had advised me it was my choice. You don't have to, she said, but sometimes it's useful to see what they're positioning. I let them come. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table where I had slid the gold gift bag across to Daniel 6 months ago. He looked tired and thinner than even his gym leaner version, and I noticed he was not wearing his wedding ring, which was new. Philip Garrett had a leather portfolio and a pen and the particular expression of a man who has decided in advance how this conversation will go. It opened warmly enough. Philip said they appreciated my willingness to talk. He said Daniel was committed to an amicable resolution. He used the word amicable 4 times in the first 5 minutes, which I counted. He spoke about the shared history, the shared assets, the desire to avoid protracted litigation that benefits no one. Then came the offer. They proposed a settlement. Daniel would keep the house. I would receive a lump sum. Generous. Philip framed it. Notably generous. Plus a waiver of any claim against Daniel's pension. In exchange, I would sign a full and final settlement and withdraw the claim regarding the corporate card expenditures, which Philip described as a minor accounting issue that's been somewhat overstated. I looked at Daniel when Philip said minor accounting issue. Daniel looked at the table. That's interesting, I said. Philip smiled. We think it's a fair starting point for... It's not, I said. Philip's smile didn't disappear exactly. It rearranged itself. Mara, I think if you speak with your attorney about the realistic outcomes here... I have spoken with my attorney, I said, extensively. Then Courtney Walsh walked in. I had not heard a car in the driveway. I did not know she had been in Daniel's car waiting. She came through the back door, the door from the garage, the door that required either a key or someone who had been given the code, and my stomach turned, not with surprise, but with a specific kind of fury that I had to put some distance between myself and very quickly. She was exactly as she'd been in the photographs, tall, blonde, younger than I'd registered in still images. She sat down at the table next to Daniel and placed her hand over his, and looked at me with an expression she had clearly prepared in advance. Sympathetic, reasonable, slightly sorrowful. "I know you don't want to hear from me," she said, "but I wanted you to know that Daniel loves you. He's not trying to hurt you with this. We both just want—" "Stop," I said. She stopped. "You entered my house through a door that requires a code that I did not give you," I said. I kept my voice completely level. "Which means Daniel gave it to you, which means you've probably used it before." She opened her mouth. I held up one hand. "You called me 2 months ago and told me you'd make this as difficult as possible for me. Sandra Okafor has the record of that call, the timestamp, the number, the content." I looked at Philip Garrett, who had gone quite still. "I'm going to ask you to leave my house now. All of you. If there are further settlement discussions, they will happen through my attorney." Philip began to say something about good faith. I stood up. "I'll give you a few minutes," I said, and walked out of my own kitchen and stood in the hallway, heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I heard them gather their things. I heard Daniel say, very quietly to someone, I couldn't tell who, "This isn't going to work." He was right. It wasn't. I heard the front door close. I waited another minute. Then I went back to the kitchen, which was empty, and I stood there in the afternoon light and let the fear finish moving through me. Because it was there. Real and physical. The knowledge that they had resources and motivation and a willingness to push. That Courtney, specifically, was not someone who would simply step back and let this resolve cleanly. But the fear, when I really sat with it, didn't feel like what I'd expected. It didn't feel like a reason to stop. It felt, strangely, like proof that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. You don't frighten someone who's powerless. You frighten someone who's winning. I called Sandra and told her everything about Courtney in the house, about the garage code, about Philip Garrett and the settlement offer. "Good," Sandra said when I finished. "Write it all down tonight with times, all of it." I did. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in late October in Sandra's conference room on the second floor of her Oak Park office. I had been preparing for 6 weeks. Sandra and I had gone through every document, every photograph, every time-stamped record until I could recite the February Door County hotel receipt from memory. I knew the dates of every late return Daniel had text messaged me about during the period of the affair. I had Ray Kowalski's full written report, 93 pages, organized and cross-referenced. I had the record of Courtney's phone call, obtained formally through our carrier at Sandra's request. I also had something else. Something Ray had found in his last round of inquiry, which he delivered 2 weeks before the deposition in his characteristic flat, unhurried way. I flagged something you'll want to bring to your attorney's attention. The corporate card in question. It wasn't just the Wisconsin trip. It was 9 trips, 18 months of expense reports, some of which Daniel had filed as client entertainment. Restaurants, hotel rooms in the city, a weekend in New Orleans during the period when he'd told me he was presenting at a conference. All documented. Some filed against client accounts that Ray, through a contact with forensic accounting experience, had identified as accounts that did not match the corresponding expenses. In short, Daniel hadn't just cheated on me. He had potentially committed expense fraud at his firm. Sandra presented this finding to Philip Garrett 2 days before the deposition in a letter that I was told, secondhand, arrived on his desk at 8 a.m. and caused a phone call between him and Daniel that lasted 40 minutes. I knew none of this in real time. I was in Oak Park at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, in a blazer I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Dark blue, well-fitted, the kind of thing that says, "I am not someone you should underestimate," with a cup of coffee in front of me and Sandra to my left, and I waited. I had slept well the night before, which surprised me. I had expected to lie awake running scenarios, rehearsing answers, cataloging fears. Instead, I had made dinner, called Patricia for 20 minutes, taken Henry for a long walk through the neighborhood in the cool October dark, and gone to bed at 10. I slept 7 hours without interruption. When I woke up, I lay still for a moment and took inventory of how I felt. Steady was the answer. Quietly, completely steady. Whatever was going to happen in that conference room, I had done everything within my power to prepare for it. The rest was just showing up. Philip Garrett arrived first. He looked like a man who had not slept well. He arranged his portfolio on the table with the kind of deliberate care that people use when they are trying to appear more composed than they are. Daniel arrived 5 minutes later. The sight of him across the table in a legal setting was... I had prepared myself for it to be difficult. It was not difficult. It was clarifying. Courtney was not present. She was not a party to the divorce proceeding. But I knew she was in the waiting area downstairs because Sandra's assistant had seen her. She had come with Daniel. I noted that, the way I'd learned to note everything. The deposition began. Philip had clearly strategized a version of this in which Daniel answered minimally, admitted to nothing beyond the affair itself, already disclosed, and challenged the relevance of the corporate card expenditures as a marital matter. It was a reasonable legal strategy on paper. It did not account for the fact that Sandra had had 6 weeks to prepare a different version. She asked Daniel calmly and precisely about each trip. He answered some questions with careful vagueness, others with outright denials. When she showed him the hotel receipt from Door County, he said he didn't recall the specifics. When she showed him the expense report filed during that same period that listed a client meeting in Chicago, a meeting that, according to the client's own calendar obtained through formal request, had not occurred, he said there must have been a clerical error. 9 clerical errors, Sandra said pleasantly. Over 18 months. Philip objected. Sandra acknowledged the objection and moved on. Daniel's composure, which had started as careful, became strained. There was sweat at his temple. He touched his collar once, twice. I watched him the way you watch someone from a very safe distance, with the detached attention of a person who no longer has anything to lose in this room, only things to gain. Every evasion he offered, every careful non-answer, every glance he exchanged with Philip that carried an entire panicked conversation in half a second. I watched all of it and felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had done her homework. When Sandra laid out the full accounting, the 9 trips, the discrepancy between filed expenses and actual client contacts, the estimated total, Daniel looked at Philip. Philip looked at his portfolio. Neither of them looked at me. "Mr. Ellison," Sandra said, "did your employer's compliance department receive a copy of these expense reports?" A long pause. "They would have received the standard filings, yes." "And have you been in contact with your employer's compliance department in the last 3 weeks?" Another pause. Longer. "I'd like to take a brief recess," Philip said. They took 15 minutes. I drank my coffee and Sandra made a note on her legal pad, and neither of us spoke very much, because there wasn't much that needed saying. When they returned, Philip's entire manner had changed. The $400 an hour smoothness had been replaced by something more careful, more constrained. He asked to discuss settlement. I looked at Sandra. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "We're listening," I said. The settlement that emerged from that recess bore no resemblance to the offer Philip Garrett had brought to my kitchen table in August. I received the house. I received half of our joint retirement accounts, a division to which Sandra had been entitled to push for under Illinois law from the beginning, but which the original generous offer had quietly excluded. I received a maintenance payment for 3 years to bridge any gap while I reestablished my financial independence, though I already knew I wouldn't need the full term. And the lump sum, the one they'd framed in August as generous, was replaced with a figure that was, by comparison, honest. The corporate card issue I left to Daniel's employer to resolve. That was not my department, and I was careful to keep it that way. Sandra had made the facts available through the formal discovery process. What his firm did with that information was their legal obligation, not my personal campaign. I was not interested in destroying Daniel. I was interested in leaving cleanly with what was mine. He signed everything on a Thursday in November in Sandra's conference room. He looked smaller than I remembered in a way that had nothing to do with weight. Philip Garrett was professionally composed. I was professionally composed. Sandra was, as always, entirely calm. I signed my name on the final page, and it was over. I remember walking out of Sandra's building into the November air and stopping on the sidewalk for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to mark it. 11 years of a marriage, 6 months of a fight, and now a Thursday afternoon on a quiet street in Oak Park, where the trees had lost their leaves and the sky was the flat, pale gray of late autumn in Illinois. I stood there and breathed it in. I didn't cry. I had done my crying. Alone, in the shower, in the car on the highway, in Ann Keene's office on Wednesday afternoons. I had used up what needed to be used up. What was left was something cooler and steadier. Outside on the sidewalk, Sandra shook my hand. She said, "You should be proud of how you handled this." I thanked her. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment and let it be real. Courtney Walsh, I learned later through the ordinary channels of a shared social world, mutual professional contacts, the particular small city quality of Chicago's finance circles, did not have the ending she had apparently anticipated. The expense fraud investigation at Daniel's firm had been quietly ongoing since Sandra's letter reached Philip Garrett. By December, Daniel had been placed on administrative leave. By January, he had been terminated. The firm did not pursue criminal charges. The amounts, while significant, sat in a gray zone, and the reputational cost of a public proceeding was not something either party wanted. But the professional consequences were concrete. His securities license was under review, his professional references were effectively destroyed, and word traveled, the way it does in that world, efficiently and without mercy. He found consulting work eventually, I heard. Smaller scale. Different city. He and Courtney had moved to Cincinnati. Her decision, apparently, or at least that was how the story was told by people who knew them. Whether it was her idea or his, or simply the logic of needing to start somewhere that wasn't Chicago, I didn't know and didn't much care. What I heard about Courtney directly, I heard only once, that she had not been promoted at Daniel's firm after the investigation, that she had resigned before they could ask for a formal accounting of what she had and hadn't known about the expense reports, and that she had relocated to Cincinnati with Daniel the following spring. Whether they were still together by then in any meaningful sense, no one seemed to know. I thought about calling her once. Standing in my kitchen, in my house, I thought about it. I didn't want to gloat. I didn't want to say I told you so or any version of it. What I might have said if I'd called was simply, "You made this harder than it needed to be and it cost you." But I didn't call. It wasn't my business anymore, if it had ever been. She was a chapter that was finished. Daniel was a chapter that was finished. What I was interested in was the chapter that was beginning. I had the house rekeyed the week the divorce was final. I had the garage code changed. I stood in the kitchen on a December Saturday morning and drank my coffee in the quiet and looked out at the backyard, where the last leaves of autumn were still on the grass, waiting for the first snow. The house smelled different without him, or maybe I smelled it differently now. It smelled like mine. The first spring after the divorce, I repainted the wraparound porch, not cream-colored this time, a deep, soft sage green that I'd been looking at in paint swatches for 2 months before I committed to it. I hired 2 people to help, and we did it in a weekend. A long, physical, satisfying weekend that ended with sore arms and a porch that looked, I thought, exactly right. Like something I had chosen for myself. I kept the house, which I had worried would feel too large, too full of echoes. It didn't. It turned out that what had made it feel suffocating was not its size, but the particular presence of someone who was partly absent. The ghost of a marriage performing the motions of itself. Without that, the rooms just felt like rooms. I repainted 2 of them. I got a dog, a 3-year-old rescue mutt named Henry with enormous ears and the deep, undemanding companionship that I had not known I needed. Work got better. Without the low-grade drain of a troubled home life, I found I had energy I'd forgotten I possessed. I led a campaign that became one of the company's most successful in 3 years. My manager mentioned partnership track conversations. I booked a solo trip to Portugal for October and spent 10 days in Lisbon and the Alentejo eating well, walking constantly and sleeping in a way I hadn't in years. I also slowly let my social world expand in ways it hadn't been able to during the narrowing years of the marriage. Gloria and I became genuine friends, not just work-adjacent ones. I joined a new book club, smaller and more literary than the old one. I started a pottery class on Thursday evenings, something I'd wanted to try for years and never had, and discovered I was terrible at it and found this delightful. Patricia came to visit in June and stayed for 2 weeks, and we spent most of it on the porch or in the garden, talking about everything and nothing the way we had when we were young. She brought her partner, David, who turned out to love cooking, and the 3 of us made elaborate dinners every night and ate them outside because June in Elmhurst, at its best, is soft and golden and worth being outside for. "You look different," Patricia said one evening. We were on the new sage-green porch with wine, watching Henry make his slow, dignified patrol of the yard. "Different how?" "Like yourself," she said. "Like you again." I thought about that for a long time after she said it. Like yourself. I wasn't sure I'd been entirely myself during the marriage, not the later years of it anyway. I'd been a version of myself that had been gradually, not maliciously, but steadily compressed, made smaller to fit a space that was shrinking. I was not small anymore. I heard about Daniel and Courtney sporadically through the ordinary drift of information in a social world. They had moved to Cincinnati, as I'd known. He was working for a small regional advisory firm, competent work from what I understood, but a significant step down from the career trajectory he'd been on. Courtney was working in marketing now, having left finance. They were together, apparently. I had no feelings about this that I could identify as either satisfaction or sorrow. They were simply there, in a city I'd never much thought about, living a life I was not part of. What I heard, indirectly, was that it wasn't easy, that the circumstances of their origin, the deception, the investigation, the hasty relocation, had left a residue that didn't clean up neatly, that Courtney had, more than once, apparently thrown the phrase "you cost me my career" at Daniel during arguments that friends of friends had been privy to in the way that people in their 30s sometimes are in shared apartments and thin walls. Whether this was true or shaped by the particular alchemy of secondhand information, I couldn't say. I didn't spend much time thinking about it. Their unhappiness, if it existed, was their own, not a consequence I had engineered, not a victory I had won. It was simply the natural result of a thing poorly built from the beginning. The thing I had built, by contrast, felt solid, felt for the first time in years entirely mine. In September, 14 months after I'd found a pale blonde hair on my side of the bed, I sat on the sage green porch on a warm evening with Henry at my feet and a glass of wine and the particular feeling of a life that fits. Not perfect, not without difficulty or loneliness or the ordinary sorrows of a woman in her late 30s navigating something new, but honest, clean, mine. I thought about the gold gift bag. I thought about sliding it across the breakfast table. I thought about Daniel's face. I had given him, in that moment, something he hadn't expected: accountability. And in doing so, I had given myself something I hadn't expected either: a beginning. Here is what I learned. Evidence is everything. Silence is power. A plan made calmly and carried out carefully is worth more than any amount of noise. And this, the life that comes after the thing you were afraid of, is often, if you let it be, the better one. I looked at a single hair on my bed and asked myself what I was willing to do about it. The answer, as it turned out, was everything necessary and nothing more. What would you have done? Would you have kept quiet, looked away, told yourself it was nothing? I'd love to know. Leave a comment. Your perspective matters to me. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more to come. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.